It was supposed to be a quiet day. A simple haircut at Max's Cuts, his favorite barbershop in the city. Detective Frank Doyle, an off-duty black cop with a stocky build and an ever-expanding gut, just wanted a break from the chaos of his job. As he settled into the worn leather barber chair, his eyes closed for a moment of peace, the door swung open violently. A gang of thugs stormed in, their leader grinning like a predator spotting its prey. What they didn't realize, what no one in the shop knew, was that Frank had made a pact long ago, one that gave him strength beyond his appearance. They were about to find out the hard way. Don't forget to like and comment where you are from. A routine broken. The rhythmic hum of electric clippers filled the air, blending with the low murmur of conversations and the faint jazz music playing from an old speaker in the corner. The scent of aftershave and warm shaving cream lingered in the small bustling barbershop, wrapping around Frank Doyle like a familiar embrace. He exhaled, sinking deeper into the leather chair, his thick fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. It was rare for him to have a moment of stillness. His life as a detective in the city's toughest precinct rarely afforded him such luxuries. "Frank, you're stressing my chair out, man," Max chuckled, carefully lining up Frank's hair with practiced precision. "Relax. You look like you're about to interrogate the damn mirror." Frank smirked but said nothing. He wasn't tense because of work. It was something deeper, a nagging weight in the pit of his stomach he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was just the exhaustion catching up to him, or maybe it was the familiar itch, his instincts telling him something was off. The bell above the door chimed, and Frank's eyes flicked to the entrance out of habit. A teenager walked in, glancing around before taking a seat near the window. No threat. Just a kid waiting for his turn. Still, Frank's instincts whispered otherwise. He ignored it, letting his eyes drift closed again. Max continued with the cut, the buzzing of the clippers lulling Frank into a momentary sense of ease. But then it happened. The door swung open with such force that the bell barely had time to jingle before slamming against the wall. The shop fell silent, tension thickening the air in an instant. Frank's eyes snapped open, his heart rate spiking as his gaze locked onto the figures storming in, 6 of them. Dressed in dark clothing, faces etched with the arrogance of those who had nothing to lose. The leader, a wiry man with a scar cutting across his cheek, scanned the room with a predatory grin. His eyes landed on Frank almost immediately. Well, look what we got here," the leader sneered, stepping forward with an exaggerated swagger. "Detective Doyle, long time no see." Frank didn't move. He didn't have to. Instead, he let his gaze settle on the man, his jaw tightening slightly. "Rico," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent dealing with the city's worst. "Should have known you'd crawl out from under your rock sooner or later." The tension in the shop was palpable. Max had stepped back, his hands trembling slightly, while the other patrons sat frozen in their seats, eyes darting toward the nearest exits. Rico's crew spread out, positioning themselves strategically around the shop. Classic intimidation tactic. Frank had seen it 100 times before. "You still cracking jokes, huh?" Rico chuckled darkly. "Guess that gut of yours makes you feel untouchable." Frank's lips twitched in the ghost of a smirk. "How you here for a haircut, Rico? 'Cause Max don't do charity cases." Rico's grin faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly. He motioned to his crew, and 2 of them advanced, one flipping a chair over, sending it skidding across the floor. The shop's patrons flinched, the tension escalating. "You think this is a joke, Doyle?" Rico said, his voice lower now, more dangerous. "Nah, man. We're here because you've been sniffing around where you don't belong. Messing with my business. And I don't like that." Frank sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before sitting up straighter in the chair. He glanced around the room, mentally mapping out the exits and potential weapons. A straight razor on the counter, a heavy ashtray on the shelf by the window, the fire extinguisher near the door, options. "I'm off duty, Rico," Frank said, voice steady. "This ain't the time or place." "That's where you're wrong," Rico hissed, leaning in close, his breath reeking of cheap liquor and stale cigarettes. "It's exactly the place. And you? You're exactly the guy." Frank's muscles tensed, but he kept his expression neutral. Rico didn't know. None of them did. The Pact. The unspoken agreement Frank had made long ago with forces beyond comprehension. It wasn't a deal with the devil. It was something older, deeper, and far more binding. A pact forged in desperation, sealed with blood and regret, and it had a price. Rico snapped his fingers, and the gang members moved in. Frank remained still, letting them get close. Too close. One of them grabbed his arm, yanking him roughly to his feet. The barber chair groaned under the shift in weight. Frank's eyes flickered, and for a split second, something dark stirred within him. It was subtle, an almost imperceptible ripple beneath his skin, a fleeting shadow behind his eyes. The grip on his arm tightened, but Frank didn't flinch. Instead, he exhaled slowly, feeling the latent energy coiling within him. The Pact. It was always there, waiting, ready to be unleashed. But once it was, there was no going back. "You know, Rico," Frank said quietly, his voice low and almost different. "I was hoping for a quiet day." And then, in a blur of motion that defied his size, Frank moved. His hand shot up, seizing the wrist of the thug holding him. Bones snapped like twigs beneath his grip, and the man howled in agony, crumpling to the floor. In the same breath, Frank spun, his elbow colliding with the jaw of another assailant, sending him sprawling against the wall. The shop exploded into chaos, tables overturned, shouts filled the air and fists flew in every direction. Frank moved with a grace that didn't match his appearance, his years of experience and the unnatural strength granted by the Pact turning him into a force of nature. Rico stumbled back, eyes wide with disbelief as his crew was systematically dismantled. Frank's knuckles met flesh, sending another thug crashing into the mirror. Shards of glass rained down, reflecting the dim shop lights in a dazzling array of destruction. Rico, realizing he was outmatched, reached for something inside his jacket, a gun. Frank was faster. With a grunt, he grabbed a pair of hair clippers from the counter and hurled them with precision, striking Rico's wrist with enough force to knock the gun free. It clattered to the floor, sliding under a barber chair. Panting, Rico locked eyes with Frank, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered across his face. Frank took a step forward, looming over him. "You picked the wrong day, Rico!" Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Rico cursed under his breath, scrambling to his feet. "This ain't over, Doyle," he spat, backing toward the door. Frank wiped a trickle of blood from his lip and nodded. "It never is." As the gang fled, Max let out a shaky breath. "Man, what the hell was that, Frank?" Frank didn't answer. He simply sat back down in the barber chair, adjusting his collar. "Finish the cut, Max. I still got a day off." The shop erupted into nervous laughter, but beneath it all, Frank could still feel the Pact pulsing within him, reminding him of the power he wielded and the cost it carried. The weight of the past. The rhythmic hum of the clippers resumed, but the atmosphere inside Max's cuts was anything but calm. The shattered mirror, overturned chairs, and the nervous glances exchanged between patrons told the story of the chaos that had just unfolded. Max's hands were trembling slightly as he resumed cutting Frank's hair, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with a strained silence. "You sure you want to stay and finish, Frank?" Max asked, his voice a hushed whisper. "Those guys look serious. They might come back." Frank exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on his reflection in the remaining shards of the broken mirror. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the faint scar on his jawline, a reminder of the countless encounters he'd survived before today. "They always come back, Max. Running won't change that." Max shook his head and glanced at the entrance, the bell still swaying lightly from the gang's hasty departure. "Yeah, but what the hell was that back there, man? I've seen you throw a punch before, but that was something else." Frank's grip tightened on the armrest of the barber chair, his knuckles turning white. He didn't respond right away. How could he? How could he explain that what Max saw wasn't just skill or muscle memory? It was something darker, something he barely understood himself. The Pact had always been his secret, his burden to carry alone. And yet, the more he tried to bury it, the more it clawed its way to the surface. "I got lucky," Frank muttered, hoping the conversation would end there. But Max wasn't letting it go. "Bull!" Max shot back, lowering the clippers and leaning in. "I've known you for years, Frank. That wasn't luck. You moved like you were possessed or something." Frank's jaw tightened, and for a moment, The weight of the past threatened to spill into the present. His mind drifted back to the day it all began, the day he made the Pact. Years earlier, the Pact. The night was darker than usual, the city drenched in rain that fell in heavy sheets. Frank was younger then, leaner, but his eyes carried the same world-weary weight they did now. The case that had brought him to that alley in the dead of night was supposed to be routine. Track a missing informant, gather intel and report back. But nothing in his line of work was ever simple. He had found the informant all right, what was left of him anyway. The man's body lay twisted in a grotesque heap, eyes wide in a frozen scream. But it wasn't the work of any street gang or rival crew. No, this was something else, something unnatural. And then he saw it. The figure standing in the shadows, watching him with eyes that burned like embers. A towering presence cloaked in darkness, its voice a whisper that seemed to crawl inside his mind. "You seek strength, Detective Doyle," it had said, its voice like crushed gravel. "I can give it to you, for a price." Frank had been desperate that night. He had seen too much, lost too many. He had been tired of feeling powerless, of watching good people suffer while he was left with nothing but regret. So, against his better judgment, against everything he believed in, he had agreed. And just like that, the Pact was sealed. From that day on, things changed. His strength, his endurance, things no man his size should be capable of, they all became part of him. But with that power came whispers in the dark, fleeting glimpses of things beyond human comprehension. He had learned to suppress them, to keep the balance, but every fight, every moment of danger brought him closer to the edge. Back in the present, Frank snapped back to reality, blinking as Max waved a hand in front of his face. Earth to Frank. "You good, man?" "Yeah," Frank said, shaking off the memories. "Just tired." Max didn't press further, but his expression told Frank he wasn't convinced. The rest of the haircut passed in silence. The only sounds filling the shop were the buzzing of the clippers and the occasional nervous cough from one of the patrons. As Max dusted off the loose hairs and removed the cape from Frank's shoulders, he leaned in and said in a low voice, "You watch your back out there, all right? Rico doesn't take kindly to being embarrassed." Frank smirked, standing up and adjusting his collar. "I'll be fine, Max. Thanks for the cut." Stepping outside, the crisp evening air hit Frank like a wave, clearing the last of his lingering thoughts. The streets were alive with the usual city bustle, horns blaring, voices shouting, the scent of street food wafting through the air. It was the kind of chaos he'd grown accustomed to. As he walked toward his car parked a block away, Frank's senses remained heightened. He could feel eyes on him, the weight of unseen gazes trailing his every step. He glanced over his shoulder casually, spotting a dark sedan idling at the corner. It was the same car he'd noticed earlier that week near his precinct. Coincidence? Not likely. He sighed. Rico wasn't the type to let things go. That encounter at the barber shop was just the beginning. Slipping into his car, Frank reached for the glove compartment and pulled out his service pistol, checking the clip with practiced ease. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if it came knocking, he'd be ready. His phone buzzed, a text from Captain Harris. "Need you at the precinct ASAP, something big." Frank rubbed his temple. So much for a day off. Throwing the car into gear, he pulled onto the busy street, leaving Max's cuts behind. Unbeknownst to him, the shadows were already moving. Forces he thought he had left in the past were stirring, and the pact he had made long ago was about to demand its due. As he drove, Frank felt it again, that familiar whisper curling around his thoughts, teasing the edge of his consciousness. "You can't outrun me forever, Doyle." He gripped the wheel tighter, his jaw set. Whatever was coming next, he'd face it head on, like always. A shadow over the precinct. Frank Doyle's car rumbled to a stop in front of the 17th precinct, its dull fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the cracked pavement. He sighed, running a hand over his face before stepping out, the weight of the day already pressing heavily on his broad shoulders. His gut told him that whatever Captain Harris needed him for wasn't going to be simple. It never was. As he crossed the lobby, the usual buzz of the precinct seemed quieter, more subdued. Officers whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting towards him and quickly looking away. Something was off. Frank's instincts flared like warning bells in the back of his mind. "Detective Doyle," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see Officer Ramos, a rookie with an eager expression and a nervous energy that didn't quite fit in with the hardened atmosphere of the department. "Captain's waiting for you in the conference room," Ramos said, shifting from foot to foot. Frank gave a curt nod and made his way down the long hallway, the scent of burnt coffee and old paperwork thick in the air. The conference room door was ajar, and inside Captain Harris stood with his back to him, staring at a whiteboard covered in crime scene photos and newspaper clippings. "Harris," Frank said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Harris turned, his sharp blue eyes scanning Frank like they always did, calculating, assessing. "Doyle," he greeted, motioning for him to sit. "We've got a problem." Frank sat down, his eyes flicking to the board. The images pinned to it sent a familiar chill down his spine. Crime scene photos showing bodies mutilated beyond recognition, symbols etched into the flesh with meticulous precision. He recognized those symbols. They haunted his dreams. "Rico's crew?" Frank asked, his voice gravelly. Harris exhaled sharply, crossing his arms. "We don't know yet. The bodies started showing up 2 days ago. 3 men, all affiliated with rival gangs, found in different parts of the city. The only connection, these markings." He tapped one of the photos, his finger lingering on the twisted symbols. Frank swallowed hard. He'd seen those markings before, years ago, in the dark alleys where his pact had been forged. "This isn't Rico's style," Frank said finally. This is something else." Harris leaned against the table, eyeing him. "That's what I thought. And I need your insight on this. You've been in these streets long enough. You know things most of these guys don't." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You don't want my insight, Cap. You want my gut, and my gut's telling me we're in for a shitstorm." Harris smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Then you're on this. I want you working this case, and I want it solved fast. This city can't afford a gang war." Frank sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "And if it's not a gang war?" Harris was silent for a moment before he said, "Then it's something worse." A knock at the door interrupted them. Ramos poked his head in. "Captain, we got another one, same markings." Frank exchanged a look with Harris before standing. "Where?" "Warehouse district. It's bad, sir." Frank grabbed his coat and followed Harris out, his mind racing. The pact stirred within him, an uneasy presence lurking beneath his skin. He pushed it down, focusing on the task ahead. Warehouse district, crime scene. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the steel walls of the warehouse, painting the scene in an eerie glow. Frank stepped under the crime scene tape, his eyes narrowing as he took in the body sprawled across the cold concrete floor. It was worse than the photos. The victim's chest had been carved open, the symbols etched deep into his flesh, blood pooled around him in patterns too precise to be random. A ritual. Frank felt a shiver crawl up his spine. "Who found him?" he asked one of the uniformed officers. "Security guard on his rounds," the officer replied. "Didn't see anything, just walked in and—" He motioned to the body, his face pale. Frank crouched next to the victim, examining the markings closely. The symbols were arranged in a pattern he had seen only once before, on the night he made the pact. His jaw tightened. "Doyle." Harris's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Frank stood, facing his captain. "We need to call in an expert on this," he said, his voice low. "These markings, they're not random." Harris's face darkened. "You think it's connected to that thing you told me about?" Frank hesitated. "I don't know yet. But if it is, we're dealing with something bigger than gangs." A uniformed officer approached, holding a plastic evidence bag. "Found this near the body, sir." Frank took the bag and his stomach dropped. Inside was an old, tattered playing card, the King of Spades. He stared at it for a moment before pocketing it. "Doyle?" Harris asked, noting his reaction. Frank forced a neutral expression. "Nothing, just a hunch." But inside, he knew exactly what it meant. The King of Spades wasn't just a card, it was a message from the past, from the entity he had struck a deal with all those years ago. It was watching him, and it wanted something. "Let's wrap this up," Frank said, turning to leave. "I've got work to do." As he walked back to his car, the whispers returned, curling around his mind like smoke. The debt is never truly paid, Frank. His grip on the wheel tightened as he drove off into the night, knowing that his day off was officially over, and so was any hope of leaving the past behind. Whispers in the dark. Frank parked his car a block away from his apartment, sitting in the driver's seat longer than necessary, staring at the King of Spades card now resting on the dashboard. His fingers drummed anxiously against the steering wheel. The weight of the card felt heavier than it should, not just a piece of paper, but a reminder of the debt that still lingered. He had made a pact, a desperate deal years ago, and now it was knocking at his door again. He sighed heavily and grabbed the card, stuffing it into his pocket before stepping out into the cool night air. The streetlights flickered weakly above him, casting distorted shadows as he walked toward his building. The city never truly slept, but tonight it felt quieter, like it was holding its breath. Inside his apartment, the air was stale. He locked the door behind him and flicked on the light, only to freeze in place. A figure sat in his living room chair, cloaked in shadow. The dim glow from the street outside illuminated the sharp contours of a face he hadn't seen in years. Morris, the man responsible for introducing him to the Pact. "You shouldn't leave your door so easy to pick, Doyle," Morris said, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Frank gritted his teeth, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his gun. "What the hell are you doing here, Morris?" Morris leaned forward, his dark eyes gleaming with something between amusement and danger. "We need to talk, Frankie, about your little problem." Frank didn't move. "I don't have a problem." Morris chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, man. You think you can just walk away from something like this? That card in your pocket says otherwise." Frank pulled out the King of Spades and tossed it onto the coffee table. "Yeah? What does it mean?" Morris picked up the card, flipping it between his fingers. "It means your time's running out. The gang at the barber shop. They weren't just after a quick payday. They were looking for you. And they weren't working alone." Frank's jaw clenched. "Who sent them?" "That's the fun part." Morris leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It wasn't Rico or any of the usual suspects. This goes deeper. Your friends from the other side, they're getting impatient. They want their payment." Frank felt the familiar chill crawl up his spine. The deal he had made all those years ago had given him the strength to survive, to take down criminals others couldn't touch. But the Pact had a price, one he had been delaying far too long. "I told them I needed more time," Frank muttered. Morris laughed, the sound low and mocking. "Time? You're fresh out, buddy. They want what's owed, and if you don't pay up, they'll collect in ways you won't like." Frank ran a hand down his face, exhaustion creeping into his bones. "What do they want?" Morris's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Simple. A life for a life. You've been dodging your dues and they've been patient. But now, they want you to choose. Give them someone, or they'll take someone." Frank's stomach churned. "No, that's not how this works." "Oh, but it is," Morris said, standing up slowly. "You thought you could use their power and just walk away. It doesn't work like that. They gave you strength, invulnerability, everything you needed to survive in your job, and now they want payment in blood." Frank's hands balled into fists. He'd done everything to avoid this moment, to push down the reality of what he had agreed to in the desperate years of his early career. But now it was staring him in the face, and the thought of losing someone he cared about to that debt made his blood boil. Morris moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "You've got a choice, Doyle. Someone innocent, or someone who deserves it. You know the city's filled with bad guys. Maybe it's time you cleaned house and got them off your back in the process." Frank didn't respond, his mind racing. "I'll be in touch," Morris said before disappearing into the night, leaving Frank standing alone in the quiet hum of his apartment, the weight of the decision pressing on his chest like a vice. The stakes are set. Sleep eluded Frank that night. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the badge lying in front of him. It represented justice, everything he had sworn to protect. But now the lines were blurring. Was it really justice if he delivered someone the Pact demanded? Would it be so wrong to take out a criminal in exchange for his freedom? He glanced at his phone. Unread messages from his partner, Detective Lisa Banks, flickered on the screen. She had been worried about him after the barbershop incident. He knew she wouldn't understand what he was dealing with. Not fully. Lisa always believed in the law, the rules. She wouldn't approve of his next move if he went through with it. Frank stood pacing the room. His gut twisted at the thought of choosing a target, but deep down he knew there was one name that came to mind. Rico, the city's most untouchable drug lord. The man had left a trail of destruction across every neighborhood Frank had ever patrolled, and despite numerous arrests, he always walked free thanks to his deep connections. If anyone deserved to pay the price, it was him. But could Frank cross that line? His thoughts were interrupted by a noise outside. Instinct took over. He grabbed his gun and moved to the window, peering through the blinds. A black car sat idling across the street, the glow of a cigarette visible through the windshield. Watching. Waiting. Frank exhaled sharply. They were already closing in. He had to act. The plan takes shape. By morning, Frank had made his decision. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hand over an innocent life, but he needed to buy time to figure out a way out of the Pact's clutches. At the precinct, Lisa met him at his desk, her brow furrowed with concern. "You look like hell, Frank." "Thanks," he muttered, flipping open a file on Rico's latest activities. "I need your help." Lisa frowned. "With what?" Frank hesitated. "Rico. I think it's time we took him down. For good." Lisa's eyes widened. "Frank, we've tried before. He's untouchable." "Not this time," Frank said, his voice firm. "I've got a plan." Lisa studied him for a long moment. "Tell me you're not doing something stupid." Frank forced a tired smile. "Just trust me, Lisa." He couldn't tell her the whole truth, not yet. But as he stared at the mugshot of Rico pinned to the board, he knew this was the only way forward. If he could take Rico down, maybe, just maybe, he could buy his way out of the Pact's grip once and for all. Frank Doyle was done running. Now, it was time to fight. Setting the trap. Frank sat in his office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the stacks of case files that had piled up over the years. His eyes remained fixed on the mugshot of Rico, the city's most elusive criminal mastermind. The face staring back at him was one of calculated arrogance, a man who had built his empire on fear, corruption, and an untouchable network of powerful allies. Taking Rico down wasn't just about justice anymore, it was survival. Frank knew that his pact demanded blood, but he was determined to make it count. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp knock at his office door. Lisa Banks walked in, her expression tense, eyes scanning his cluttered desk before landing on the mugshot. She crossed her arms, her voice low and firm. "You're really going after him, aren't you?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Frank leaned back in his chair, letting out a heavy sigh. "I don't have a choice, Lisa. He's a walking crime syndicate. If I don't act now, he's going to keep slipping through the cracks." Lisa studied him for a long moment before pulling out a chair and sitting down. "Frank, I get it. But if you're thinking about going off the books, you need to tell me now." Frank hesitated. He trusted Lisa more than anyone, but there were things she couldn't know. Not yet. "I'll do what needs to be done," he said carefully. Lisa's jaw tightened. "Then let's do it right." "What's the plan?" Frank smirked. "I'm glad you asked." The plan in motion. The first step was to create an opportunity, one that would force Rico out into the open. Frank and Lisa spent the next few hours poring over surveillance reports, financial statements, and informant tips. It wasn't long before they found their in. "Rico's got a drop scheduled for tomorrow night," Lisa said, pointing to a map spread across Frank's desk. "An abandoned warehouse near the docks. It's his usual spot for handling big deals, clean, out of sight, and crawling with his guys." Frank nodded, eyes scanning the layout. "Perfect. We'll set up an anonymous tip to the feds, just enough to spook him. He'll either cut and run or try to fight his way out. Lisa frowned. And you think he'll fight? He's too arrogant to run, Frank said, cracking his knuckles. He'll try to control the situation, and that's where we'll have him. Lisa leaned back in her chair. And what about backup? We can't do this alone. Frank tapped the side of his temple. We won't be alone. I've got other resources. Lisa eyed him suspiciously. Frank, what does that mean? Just trust me, he said, avoiding her gaze. This ends tomorrow. A dangerous night. The docks were eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic lapping of water against the wooden piers. The moon cast a pale glow over the abandoned warehouse, giving the entire scene an almost cinematic quality. Frank crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, his heart pounding in his chest. Lisa's voice crackled through the earpiece. You in position? Yeah, Frank whispered, eyes locked on the entrance of the warehouse. Any sign of our friend? Not yet. I've got eyes on a few of his men, though. This place is packed with muscle. Frank smirked. Good. I like a challenge. Moments later, a convoy of black SUVs rolled up, their headlights slicing through the darkness. The warehouse doors creaked open, and Rico stepped out, flanked by his usual entourage of thugs. He was dressed sharp, as always, a silver watch glinting under the moonlight. Frank took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He felt the weight of the Pact pulsing inside him, a subtle but powerful reminder of the strength that lurked beneath his skin. He could feel it coiling, waiting to be unleashed. All right, Frank whispered into the comms. Let's make some noise. Lisa gave the go-ahead, and within seconds, the distant sound of sirens echoed through the docks. Panic rippled through Rico's men, their heads snapping toward the incoming lights. Frank used the distraction to slip closer, moving with surprising agility despite his bulk. As Rico barked orders, sending his men scattering, Frank emerged from the shadows. Going somewhere, Rico? Rico froze for a split second before recovering, his lips curling into an amused smirk. Detective Doyle. You've got some nerve showing up here. Frank's grin was anything but friendly. I have my moments. Rico's eyes darted to his men, who were already drawing their weapons. Frank's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. The Pact was ready, surging through his veins like fire. You should have stayed out of this, Doyle, Rico sneered. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Frank rolled his shoulders, feeling the power simmering beneath his skin. Yeah? I like my odds. The first thug lunged at him, but Frank was faster than he had any right to be. He caught the man's wrist mid-swing, twisting it with bone-cracking force before sending him flying into a stack of crates. The others hesitated, their confidence shaken. Rico's smirk faltered. What the hell? Frank advanced, his movements precise and unstoppable. Every punch landed with bone-shattering force, every block absorbing blows that would have knocked out an ordinary man. Rico's men fell one by one, their confidence evaporating with each brutal takedown. Lisa's voice crackled through the comms. Frank, what the hell are you doing in there? Cleaning house, Frank replied, dodging a blade with unnatural speed before slamming his fist into another thug's ribs, sending him crumpling to the floor. Rico, now visibly shaken, backed toward the SUV. You're not human, he muttered, eyes wide with something close to fear. Frank wiped a trickle of sweat from his brow. No, not anymore. Before Rico could escape, Frank lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the hood of the SUV. You're done, Rico, he growled. Your empire ends tonight. Rico struggled, his arrogance replaced by desperation. Please, Doyle, we can make a deal. Frank leaned in close, his voice low and menacing. The only deal I'm making is you in cuffs. Lisa finally arrived with backup, securing the scene as Frank hauled Rico to his feet. The once untouchable crime boss looked small, beaten and afraid. You did it, Lisa said, panting slightly. But how the hell did you... Frank shook his head, cutting her off. Later. Right now, let's get him booked. As they led Rico away, Frank glanced at his hands. The power within him was still there, still simmering, still hungry. He had won tonight, but he knew the Pact wasn't done with him yet. And deep down, he wondered if it ever would be. Consequences and revelations. Frank Doyle sat on the edge of his bed, staring down at his bruised knuckles. The events of the night before played in his mind like a broken record. Every punch, every blow, every impossible feat of strength he had unleashed in the barbershop and at the docks. His heart still pounded with the adrenaline that coursed through his veins, but now, in the silence of his dimly lit apartment, the weight of his pact pressed down on him. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Lisa. "We need to talk. Now." Frank sighed, running a hand over his face before grabbing his jacket and heading out. The meeting. Lisa was waiting at their usual diner, a small 24-hour joint on the corner of 5th and Main. She sat in a booth by the window, nursing a cup of black coffee. Her eyes, usually filled with quiet confidence, now carried an edge of something deeper. Concern, maybe even fear. Frank slid into the seat across from her, offering a tired smirk. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Lisa didn't return the smile. "Maybe I have," she said, leaning in. "Frank, what the hell happened last night?" Frank shrugged, reaching for the sugar dispenser. "We got the bad guys. Case closed." Lisa grabbed his wrist, stopping him mid-pour. "No, Frank, I saw what you did. You took down 5 armed men like they were paper dolls. I've known you a long time, and I've seen you in action, but that wasn't normal." Frank held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I told you, Lisa, I've got my resources." She sat back, crossing her arms. "Don't give me that. We're talking superhuman-level stuff here. Strength, speed. And I swear, for a second, your eyes changed." Frank's grip on the coffee cup tightened, the ceramic groaning under the pressure. He exhaled sharply and leaned closer. "Look, you don't want to know. Trust me." Lisa's eyes narrowed. "I'm already in this, Frank. Tell me the truth." Frank sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "It's complicated. Then uncomplicated." Frank leaned back, scanning the diner. The hum of conversation around them offered some privacy, but paranoia had become second nature. He spoke low. "Years ago I made a deal. A pact, if you will." Lisa's brows furrowed. "A deal? With who?" Frank hesitated. "Let's just say it wasn't exactly legal or normal." Lisa's face paled slightly. "What did you do, Frank?" Frank's jaw tightened. "I needed an edge. The streets were getting worse, criminals getting smarter. I was desperate, so I went to someone who promised me strength. The kind of strength that could level the playing field." Lisa's eyes darted around nervously. "And now?" "Now," Frank said with a grim smile, "I'm learning that every deal comes with a cost. The cost of power." That night, Frank sat in his apartment, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The faint glow of the city outside cast strange shadows across his face. His eyes, once warm and brown, flickered with something darker, something unnatural. He clenched his fists, feeling the power surging beneath his skin. It was intoxicating, yet terrifying. He had always thought he could control it, keep it in check. But last night at the docks he had nearly lost himself. The rush of combat, the thrill of domination. It was becoming too easy to give in. A sudden knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. He grabbed his gun from the sink, heart pounding. Moving cautiously, he peered through the peephole. Lisa. Frank exhaled in relief, unlocking the door. "You really gotta stop showing up unannounced," he muttered. Lisa pushed past him, her face tense. "We've got a problem, Frank." He shut the door and turned to face her. "What now?" She tossed a manila folder onto his table. "Internal Affairs is sniffing around. They're asking questions about what happened at the barbershop and the docks. Witnesses are talking about you." Frank's jaw tightened. "I figured they would." Lisa crossed her arms. "Frank, this isn't just rumors. They're bringing in forensic analysts, reviewing footage. And worse, someone's been leaking information to the press." Frank grabbed the folder and flipped it open. Grainy photos showed him in action at the docks. Too fast, too strong, too inhuman. His stomach twisted. "Damn it." Lisa sat on the edge of the couch, her expression softer now. "Look, I know you're trying to do the right thing, but you have to be careful. If they dig too deep, they're going to find something they won't be able to explain. And then what? Frank sank into the chair, rubbing his temples. I don't know, Lisa, but I can't just sit back and do nothing. Rico was just the tip of the iceberg. There's something bigger going on in this city, and I'm the only one who can stop it. Lisa shook her head. You don't have to do it alone, Frank. Let me help you. Whatever this thing is, we'll figure it out together. Frank looked at her, a small smirk tugging at his lips. You're too good for this city, Lisa. And you're too stubborn for your own good, she shot back. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. Finally, Frank stood. All right. First things first, we need to find out who's leaking to the press. Someone's trying to paint me as a monster, and I intend to find out who. Lisa nodded. I'll dig through my sources. You just stay out of trouble. Frank chuckled. No promises. A shadow in the dark. Later that night, Frank walked the streets of his neighborhood, his eyes scanning the alleys and rooftops for any sign of trouble. He knew better than to think he was safe. The Pact had made him stronger, but it had also made him a target. As he rounded a corner, a figure stepped out of the shadows. A tall man dressed in a long black coat, his face obscured by the dim streetlights. Detective Doyle, the man said in a voice like gravel. We need to talk. Frank's hand hovered over his holster. Who the hell are you? The man took a step closer, his eyes glinting with something unnatural. Someone who knows about your little arrangement. Frank's blood ran cold. You think you're the only one who's made a deal? The man continued, a sinister smile creeping onto his lips. You're just getting started, detective, and trust me, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Frank's grip tightened on his gun. Then why don't you enlighten me? The man chuckled. Soon, but for now, watch your back, because you're not the only one who's made a pact, and some of us, we don't play by the rules. And with that, the stranger melted back into the darkness, leaving Frank standing alone on the empty street, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. The hunter becomes the hunted. Frank Doyle couldn't shake the ominous words of the stranger who had disappeared into the shadows. You're not the only one who's made a pact. Those words gnawed at his mind like a parasite, burrowing deep into his thoughts. What did it mean? Who else had made a deal? And more importantly, what were they capable of? Back in his apartment, Frank locked the door behind him and paced the living room, his instincts on high alert. The city outside his window stretched into the night, the flickering streetlights barely cutting through the darkness. He had spent years chasing down criminals, but now he was facing something far beyond his pay grade. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Frank moved cautiously, his hand hovering over his sidearm. He peered through the peephole and relaxed slightly. It was Lisa. Lisa, it's late, Frank said as he opened the door. Lisa pushed past him, a bundle of folders in her arms. Yeah, well, trouble doesn't exactly run on a 9-to-5 schedule. Frank smirked and shut the door. What did you find? Lisa dropped the folders on the coffee table and looked him dead in the eye. A whole lot of things you're not going to like. Someone's been watching you, Frank, and not just the usual suspects. Frank's brow furrowed. Go on. Lisa opened one of the folders, revealing a series of surveillance photos, grainy shots of Frank outside the barber shop, in his car, and even outside his apartment. These were taken over the past month. Someone's been tailing you without you even noticing. Frank's eyes darkened. Damn it. I should have seen this coming. Lisa flipped to another set of documents. And there's more. These are reports on other cops, ones who've mysteriously disappeared over the years. Most of them were investigating cases tied to the same gang that hit the barbershop. But get this, there's a pattern. She traced her finger along a timeline. Every single one of them reported feeling off, noticing things out of place, strange encounters, and then poof, they vanished. Frank leaned against the counter, processing the information. You're telling me this goes deeper than just street-level crime? Lisa nodded. I think whoever's behind this, they're not just criminals, Frank. They're something else. Frank exhaled slowly. Then we dig deeper. No turning back now. The streets speak. The next day, Frank hit the streets with Lisa by his side. They visited informants, old connections, and a few dive bars where whispers of the criminal underworld thrived. Every conversation led to dead ends, until they found Rico's former associate, a low-level hustler named Benny the Rat Morales, hiding out in a dingy motel on the east side. Frank banged on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open just enough to reveal Benny's paranoid eyes. "Doyle? What the hell, man? I told you I don't know anything." Frank pushed the door open and stepped inside, his presence filling the cramped space. "I think you know plenty, Benny, and you're gonna start talking." Benny gulped, backing away toward the bed. "I don't want trouble." Lisa crossed her arms. "Too late for that, pal. Start talking." Benny sighed, rubbing his face. All right. Look, I heard things about people making deals for my power. Not just street-level stuff, but real power, like supernatural crap, man." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Keep talking." Benny licked his lips nervously. "There's a guy. Goes by Bishop. He's the one pulling the strings now. And trust me, he ain't like the others. People say he's been around for decades, and he never ages." Frank exchanged a glance with Lisa. "Where do we find him?" Benny shook his head violently. "No way, man. Bishop don't like visitors. You go looking for him, and you're dead before you even get close." Frank grabbed Benny's collar and pulled him in. "Let me worry about that." "Where, Benny?" After a moment of hesitation, Benny whispered, "Warehouse by the docks. Midnight." "But you didn't hear it from me." Frank released him and stepped back. "You're a real patriot, Benny." As they left the motel, Lisa shot Frank a concerned look. "A guy who doesn't age? You think it's related to your situation?" Frank's jaw tightened. "Let's find out." The confrontation. By midnight, Frank and Lisa were positioned near the docks, watching the dilapidated warehouse Benny had pointed them to. The place reeked of rust and salt water, and the dim security lights barely illuminated the cracked pavement. "I don't like this," Lisa whispered. "Feels too quiet." Frank adjusted his holster. "That's because it is." Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall man in a dark coat flanked by two equally menacing goons. Frank's eyes locked onto him instantly. "Bishop," Frank muttered. The man smiled, his face eerily smooth for someone rumored to have been around for decades. "Detective Doyle, I've heard a lot about you." Frank stepped forward. "I wish I could say the same," Bishop chuckled. "Oh, but you do know me, or at least you know what I am. You see, Frank, you're not the only one who made a pact, but unlike you, I embraced it." Frank clenched his fists. "What do you want?" Bishop's grin widened. "What I want is for you to stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. You made a deal for power, Frank, but power comes with responsibilities. And trust me, you're way in over your head." Lisa tightened her grip on her gun. "You don't scare us." Bishop's eyes darkened and his voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "Then you haven't been paying attention." Without warning, Bishop moved, fast, too fast. Before Frank could react, Lisa was slammed against a wall, her gun skidding across the pavement. Frank charged, landing a punch that should have shattered Bishop's jaw, but the man barely flinched. Instead, he grinned wider, his eyes gleaming with something otherworldly. "Looks like your little pact isn't quite enough," Bishop taunted. Frank growled, swinging again, this time channeling the strength of his pact. The impact sent Bishop flying into a stack of crates, shattering them on impact. Lisa scrambled to her feet, aiming her backup gun at Bishop. "Frank, we need to get out of here." Frank wiped the sweat from his brow, his heart pounding. "Not yet." Bishop stood up slowly, brushing off debris. "You're going to regret that, detective." Suddenly, from the shadows, more figures emerged. Bishop's reinforcements. Frank cursed under his breath. "We're outnumbered." Lisa fired a warning shot into the air. "Time to go, Frank." Reluctantly, Frank grabbed her hand and they bolted toward the car. As they sped away from the docks, Lisa panted heavily. "That guy, he's not human." Frank gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Neither am I. Not anymore." As the city lights blurred past, one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. The final reckoning. Frank Doyle stood at the edge of the rooftop, the cold wind cutting through his sweat-soaked shirt. The city below stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of neon lights and dark alleys, his battlefield. Bishop lay sprawled at his feet, battered, bruised, but still smirking. The man, or whatever he was tougher than Frank had imagined. "How you think this ends with me?" Bishop coughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "There are more like me, more like you." Frank tightened his fists. He could feel the raw power coursing through his veins, the pact he had made pulsing inside him like an unstoppable force. But tonight he realized something. Power without control is just destruction waiting to happen. "Maybe," Frank said, his voice steady, "but tonight it ends with you." With one final strike, Frank sent Bishop crashing through the rooftop's edge, his body vanishing into the darkness below. The eerie silence that followed carried more weight than the roar of battle ever could. Lisa staggered onto the rooftop, gun still raised. "Is it over?" Frank wiped the sweat from his brow, staring into the abyss where Bishop had disappeared. "For now." He turned to her, a tired smile on his face. "But I get the feeling my quiet days are officially over." Lisa chuckled, holstering her gun. "Guess you're stuck with me then," Frank nodded. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The aftermath. The days that followed were a blur of reports, cover-ups, and sleepless nights. The media spun a different story. Gang activity gone wrong, a brave detective taking down a dangerous syndicate. But Frank knew the truth, and so did Lisa. Sitting in his apartment, staring at the files Lisa had collected over the weeks, Frank realized this was bigger than he'd ever imagined. If Bishop was just the beginning, how many more were lurking in the shadows, making pacts of their own? As he took a sip of his now cold coffee, a knock echoed through the door. He didn't need to check to know it was Lisa. She stepped inside, dropping a thick dossier on his table. "Looks like there's another one, Frank. Another deal maker." Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "And here I thought I'd finally get some rest." Lisa smirked. "Come on, you'd be bored within a week." Frank chuckled, grabbing his coat. "Let's go see what trouble we can stir up." A message to the viewers. Frank's story reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes the strongest people are the ones no one sees coming. If you made it this far, we want to hear from you. What would you do if you found yourself in Frank's shoes? Would you embrace the power or walk away? Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the journey, and subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. And remember, sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest secrets. The content is fictitious and does not reflect reality or encourage negative behaviors.